Douglas Murray joins us, Associate Editor of The Spectator, best-selling author whose book The Strange Death of Europe dealt with these Charlie Hebdo killings at some length. Douglas, very good evening.
Good to be with you, Ian.
What was your initial reaction when you heard that they were going to republish these cartoons?
In a way, it was a surprise. A couple of years ago, the remaining staff of Charlie Hebdo actually announced that they would not be publishing any cartoons of Muhammad in future. And that was because they had obviously gone through repeated attacks even before the attack of 2015. Their offices had been arson attacked. They'd been routinely threatened. At the time of the killings in 2015, the editor, Sharb, had a bodyguard given to him by the French state who was among those killed in the editorial office. And so within a couple of years of the killings, it was decided by the magazine they wouldn't keep doing this. And there was an obvious reason for that, which was that a lot of people in the free press around the world said how much they admired the staff of Charlie Hebdo, how much they admired the stance they took in defense of secularism and of the secular principles of France, but nobody else was willing to publish the cartoon. So, as it were, Charlie Hebdo always remained out on a limb. And it was understandable, if I think sad, that the remaining staff felt intimidated into not publishing such cartoons. But this announcement today is very striking because what they've said is, if we were ever going to do cartoons of Muhammad again, now would be the time to publish them or republish them, because this is the trial of people who were involved in the massacre of almost the entirety of the staff.
But you could, I suppose, interpret it as almost interfering with the course of justice, couldn't you? Trying to influence the trial by doing this in a strange sort of way.
You could. I mean, I'm not sure if that's foremost on the minds or at all on the minds of the remaining staff of the magazine. I mean, if you read, there's a book by one of the few people who survived in the editorial office. In fact, the only person who I think survived in the actual editorial office. And he published a book last year in French called Disturbance, where he describes exactly what happened on the day. And I would challenge anyone who has any involvement in the media or any belief in the free press to read that book or those details without shuddering. Because what's at stake here is not really. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of misunderstanding about French culture in Britain and elsewhere. A lot of misunderstanding about its traditions of satire, its traditions of secularism in particular. And Sharb, the editor who was murdered that day, said all the time. He said, he lampooned the far right. He lampooned Marine Le Pen. He lampooned the Pope. They lampooned Mohammed. He said when people said you can't do that, Sharb said that you may not be able to do it under Islamic law, but we don't live under Islamic law. We live under French law, and French law allows us to do this. So as long as we're allowed to do it, we will continue to do it. And as I say, it is a very striking thing that so few other people in the profession of journalism or cartooning, I mean, no other magazine of satire like Private Eye ever dared stand in solidarity in the real sense with Charlie Hebdo and say, look, they can publish cartoons, so can we. Nobody else. They were left hanging. They were left vulnerable, like an animal left away from the herd when the rest of the media stampeded away from any connection with doing something that is legal, totally legal in French law.
I mean, do you think that at the time, the newspapers and magazines throughout the world should have republished these cartoons, or are you accusing them of cowardice for not doing so?
Yes, I do. I did at the time. I said very clearly. I knew people from Charlie Hebdo. I said immediately after the attacks, it's not enough to walk through the streets of Paris with a pencil in your hand. If you had real solidarity, everyone would walk through the streets of Paris with a cartoon of Muhammad in their hand, not to just to offend Muslims or anything, but to say, look, these things, satire, free speech, are sacred values in our society. All societies have sacred values, and we have some. I said at the time, yes, of course. And I know that a number of editors in our own country were in discussions to see if they could, as one, in a sort of one for all for one thing, actually at least show readers. It's not even joining in, just show readers what the cartoons were for which these men and women were murdered. But the British press didn't do that. And I know how febrile it was. I was much involved at the time in this. I was visited. I mean, I'm not breaking any news here, but I was visited by the British police at that time telling me not to appear in public for the foreseeable future. It happened to other journalists in our own country. This is not that far away, and it has to be on our minds that, freedom of speech is never that far away from being crushed and shot at the barrel of a gun.
But I suppose we could ask the question, well, if they do republish these cartoons, they have made a decision to offend several million people in France. I mean, okay, not all Muslims are going to be as offended by it as many would be, but I mean, it's a pretty bad thing to do, isn't it? To deliberately do this. Now, there is no law that says people can't be offended, but it's just a bit of a tasteless thing to do.
Yeah, but I mean, the life of Brian is tasteless to many very devout Christians. The Book of Mormon is very tasteless to many devout Mormons. And a lot of my Muslim friends now have no problem with the idea that a magazine should publish cartoons of Muhammad. And in fact, one of your colleagues at LBC, Majid Nawaz, got into a rather difficult corner on this himself when he said, as a Muslim, I don't have any problem with this. And people attacked him for being a Muslim, saying, I don't have any problem. Lots of Muslims don't have a problem with the idea of free speech. And my worry is that all of this actually instills an idea that, Islam can never cope with criticism and should be treated differently. And Sharp and the other late murdered staff of Charlie Hebdo always said, it's not that you treat Islam uniquely differently, you treat it the same as everyone else. And that's real equality and that's real freedom. But in the end, they died for it.
Now, you have a new book out?
I do indeed. It's very kind of you to mention it.
I haven't. You mentioned it. What's the title?
It's called The Madness of Crowds, and it's on the happy issues that are roiling society other than this one at the moment. Everything to do with the awful disintegration of our societies along racial, sexual, and other lines, and it's a call for sanity in an era of madness.
Well,
we'll see if it breaks through.
Well, we will see indeed, and of course, you and I are talking about this on next week's Ian Dale All Talk podcast. It's as if we got the timing right, eh? Douglas, thank you very much indeed. That's Douglas Murray, their associate editor of The Spectator.